Hey guys, how's it going? So, the Green Advent just started, and Advents don't come around too often, maybe every certain amount of months or so. And after the last Advent, I was kind of fed up with them and thinking that I would never want to see one again, but this Advent actually isn't nearly as bad as the last one. We've had the water, the fire, and now this is the grass one. And overall, I thought this one was a little bit easier to play around than the previous ones. So the rewards, I would recommend that you get basically everything in here. You should probably get all this stuff, you should probably get all these things, you should probably get all these gems that you can. And if you're not able to clear Epic Hell, then you are able to buy these 10, which I would recommend that you use to buy the light connections, and probably the speed chest, possibly the lifesteal if you really wanted, but I'd probably skip the others and prioritize, one of these two. Keep in mind you're only able to buy 2 of these chests if you get the light connections. And you get the final one from the reputation reward here, which I recommend everyone do anyways. There's a Molagora, you may as well, and you can get that as well. So, newer players should really prioritize hard difficulty. If you're able to do hell difficulty, that's great, but overall, usually it's too difficult to complete. And so I would usually recommend that people just stick to hard if they're newer. And if you're not able to do hard even because you're very new, don't worry, don't sweat it. This content is usually for more endgame players or people that have been playing for a while, and there's not too much content like that in the game, so don't feel too bad if you're not able to. Don't feel too excluded, but it really is more for an endgame player base. Now, hell difficulty is what you're going to be autoing, but epic hell is what dropped those little leaves that you can spend on stuff. So, my epic hell team, well, actually, let me just talk about this first. My hell team looks like this. I change a couple of things for my team 1 when I'm trying to do epic hell, but overall it's almost exactly the same either way. So let's talk about this guy's skills real quick. So the main thing to note about this guy is the longer the match goes, or the fights are going, the faster and stronger this boss is getting. And so if you take really long in the first phase, then by the third phase, he's actually going to be insanely strong. And so you have to be a little careful with that. You might want to speed up some of your earlier teams and make some of your later teams have a better time. He's able to strip and decrease combat readiness and stuff like that. And he puts this curse on at the beginning of the first fight where you have to use a non-attack skill to remove it. And at the end of every turn, you're taking damage if you use Stigma. So you want to kind of cleanse, and you need your highest attack person to have a non-attack skill to be able to remove that debuff. And so overall, relatively straightforward, I would say, but the main thing is these 2 manas, Retaliation mana and Counterattack mana. So basically, if you're trying to straightforwardly do this fight, you have to get rid of these, otherwise the fights will be way too difficult. So in the first phase, you have to attack its minions 4 times when you have a buff on you. Which is kind of a pain, makes it so you can't really auto it that well. But then in the second phase, it won't have this buff. And then the second phase, to get rid of this for the third phase, you have to debuff the boss with 3 debuffs and attack them 4 times, which is kind of a pain. And if those conditions are met, then in the final phase, it won't have this counterattack one, which is a huge threat. So you have to play around all these mechanics, and that's a pain. So here's what most players do. They just ignore them. They just completely ignore all these mechanics. They say, whatever, I don't care. And so then they run a team that is able to just auto this without any trouble. So let me swap around a couple of my units. We've got Saria here, and I believe Tamarin. I have a level 50 Asaria and Tamarin, but it generally works fine, right? And so this is my team for the first one, and basically I just burn down the boss, ignore its mechanics, don't care, defense break, do a bunch of damage and take it out. The second phase right here, I ignore its mechanics, and I go for a one-shot by using Stray's S3 after Watcher Shuri's, and we take the boss out, and going into the final phase, the boss has counterattacks every time you hit, but we ignore that by giving Huayang greater attack and having her kind of just bust open the boss, then using the Acades to reduce the cooldown of her S3 and giving her own vulnerability for a turn, and then we take the boss out with a second S3. So we just completely skip the mechanics, and we try to one-shot the boss basically as fast as we possibly can. And once you've made your team for Epic Hell, then it's kind of makes sense that it would work for normal hell. I just change a couple of the units here to make that first team a little faster and smoother, really. The second one is incredibly fast. The third one, I could just add maybe just Hazel and Hua Young, and it would probably take it out faster. But there's a lot of other teams you can use. You don't have to use these exact units if you're trying to skip the mechanics, and if you want to play the mechanics outright, that's a little more difficult and less people like to do that, but it's entirely possible. So this is a similar team to what I did. The first and third are the same. However, the second one's different, where how they play around that second phase is instead of one-shotting it, the mechanic makes it so every time you hit the boss, it reduces the cooldowns of the enemies, so that they're able to use their skills instantly, which is insanely dangerous since you skipped the first phase. So what you do is you just silence those enemies or put them to sleep. So you just get to skip that mechanic anyways, because the enemies can't actually use their threatening skills. Now, this is basically the same team that I'm using, except Kayron as a secondary damage dealer rather than Acades. I think Acades works actually really well, though, personally. Here's another example team. So this one actually plays around the mechanics, and it uses Kitty Clarissa and Adventure Ross to get so many single attacks on the ads that you're able to not have that pesky second phase ability. And then once you get to the second phase, you're able to debuff the boss a bunch, and you're able to make it so you get rid of the pesky counterattack stance for the third one. And then once you get to the third one, you use Alpha to defense break, and you just go in with Millum pretty much. Here's another example. This one plays around some of the rules as well, with Troublemaker, Crozet, and Violet, and Aravi being able to just counterattack all of the ads while they have buffs on. Violet is actually used in the first team a bunch if you don't have someone like Sirmia. And the second team, you pretty much just defense break and just go crazy with Spectre Tenebra. And then the third one, look, Hua-Young. Hua-Young is a very powerful one for the third phase. I'd highly recommend them if you have them. If you don't, it can be a little bit more difficult. You might have to actually play around the mechanics more. This is another example of a team that ignores the mechanics. Here we got a bunch of debuffs for this one, and Baiken actually showing up for the one-shot, probably a hunt character. I found a lot of people actually didn't have to change some of their characters too much from the PvP versions, which was nice. You didn't have to make your team super insane. It does take some optimization, but a lot of your units you might be like, oh, I already have this one built, let me just try throwing it in, maybe you have to tweak it a little bit. So this is a pretty curious team with like Mort, etc. But it's such a shame that Smallgate spends so much time working on these mechanics, and we just one-shot every single phase. We just say, nope, I don't want to deal with it, get it out of here. So these are just a few example teams, just to show that you don't have to have the same exact team as me. You'll notice a lot of characters show up multiple times, such as Sirmia, Asaria, Tamarin, Hua-Young is in almost every single team, honestly. So not having her can make it a little rough. You might have to actually play the mechanics and be a lot more careful about it. But overall, I would say this advent is easier than the previous ones, and all in all, it's totally doable. This is the first one I've ever actually been able to skip the mechanics on. Normally, I had to play around the mechanics, and it could be a huge pain, honestly. But I'm happy with my team. It didn't take an insane amount of time for me to develop, but I did have to use a good amount of gear. So let me just show a little bit of the gear that I was using. I don't have anything special in Tamarin or Asaria, so I'm not really going to show them. But for example, my Sirmia, I actually just put her on a rage set with a bunch of damage. You don't actually have to cap crit chance because she gets the extra 15% against grass, right? So I just wanted her to be fast enough to use her S2 at the right time and, you know, get a nice amount of damage, since I'm going to assume that they're defense broken probably for most of the fight, right? Then my Strays is right here. Ideally, you would want to make him ever so slightly slower, I think, because you want him to go a little bit slower than Watcher Shuri, so that Watcher Shuri is able to get the S3, then Strays, and also builds up the Hellcutter a little more. That's why I don't need as much crit chance as well. And you definitely need to make sure you have a lot of attack with the attack buff and Hellcutters so that you're able to do maximum defense pen against that boss. Then the Watcher Shuri I have is right here. So I just went for maximum damage. As I said before, he should just be a little bit faster than that Strays to make sure that he's getting the turn. Daydream Joker has half value against the boss, but it still actually is pretty good value with some characters like Watcher Shuri, especially if you have really high crit damage, since that scales it. So those are the units I use for the first ones. And then you may have noticed, but I actually have a very low level Acades. This is the Acades I used on Card of Small Miracle for extra attack. And the Mascot Hazel is a level 40 Mascot Hazel with the water gun shooter for extra attack as well. I just needed to make her go first and be faster. but really nothing too complex here, right? But as for my Hua Young, I had to put her on attack boots with flat attack. This has attack, this is attack and flat attack, that's just speed. This is percent attack and some flat attack, and that's just flat attack and attack. And so I got a whopping 7,900 attack. If I had attack set, I could actually get a lot higher. But I wanted her to be fast enough to be able to cycle turns to actually get her S3 back, and, you know, it actually worked pretty well. I think Uberius worked really well, but if you have lower attack, you could actually use something like Daydream Joker, even though it doesn't scale with the crit damage. But, yeah, those are pretty much the units I used for this. There's lots of substitutes, so you don't exactly have to use the same stuff as me. But if you're trying to copy my team, there's a lot of optimization that you could actually do past what I did. I didn't optimize it too hard. I pretty much just got it barely working, and I was like, okay, you know what, that's good enough, and it was kind of settled. So, anyways, that's kind of the rundown of Advent, I would say, this time, and I hope that this helps you a little bit. But don't feel bad if you're not able to do this too much. It's definitely not easy. But thanks a bunch for watching. I'll see you guys next time. So, here we have our Epic Hell team that we've been using. Before we go in, I'd just like to note that you should really use a pet that has increased event currency. This does count as a side story, and so it actually does work. You'll be doing a lot of runs for your reputation rewards and getting the stuff out of the shop, so I'd really recommend using something like that, even if it's not the max level one. So, we only got Stigma on one of us. It doesn't really make too much of a difference because we're going to cleanse that and heal up, so all in all, it doesn't really do too much, but the main thing is that it puts that curse on our highest attack unit, which happens to be Sirmia. So, to be doing any amount of damage, we have to remove that. So we have to get Sirmia a turn. We defense poke the boss. We're going to just push Sirmia up, because if we use just the S1, it's going to do such a minuscule amount of damage that we're not really getting a whole lot out of it. So we go for the Soul Burn here. Get a nice bit of damage on the boss. If we had higher damage on her, she would actually just straight up one-shot it, so a bit of a shame there. So those guys cleanse and heal some. Doesn't really make too much of a difference that we didn't actually kill with that, because the next two attacks, we phase the boss. Just enough damage. Now we're on the second part. You do not need Emerald Queric here. I think a character like Rose would actually work way better on something like Warhorn, like Queric. It makes it so that I need less speed on these two damage dealers, and I could just have a lot more damage on them, and it would probably make it so that I'd be able to actually easily phase this boss without it able to do much. Instead, my team is kind of sloppy because I don't have quite enough damage to actually be able to phase it immediately, which is a bit of a shame. But fortunately, it actually works out fine for us because we have such a tanky Queric right here, and we just have an invulnerable Strays, so it all works out fine. It's sloppy, but you only have to do this at all 5 total times, so it may not be pretty, but it gets the job done. So moving into the third phase. Alright. So the boss gets its 2 attacks in. That is totally fine. We don't really mind. We're just going to start with something like this. Heal the team a little bit. And then we're going to go on Mascot Hazel. Get that greater attack for the team. And we're going to Soul Burn that so we get our S3 coming back a lot sooner. We hit like a truck here, obviously. We're not messing around on the damage. Uberius puts some extra damage in at the end. We go for another. The boss is going to counterattack every single time because we ignored the phase 2 mechanic. That might do a lot of damage, but it's not really all that big of a deal. We're going to go for another S3 here. Since Acades just reduced the cooldown of it by a turn, makes it so we get back a lot sooner. Boss counterattacks, we're invulnerable, who cares? And it's going to do some damage, but it doesn't really matter because we take it out right here. So overall, I would say that that is a pretty smooth run. It can definitely be made to be a lot better. Wow, that's a pretty nice gem too. So this first wave is pretty simple overall. When it really comes down to it, all you need is a bunch of damage. There's not really any special mechanics other than the highest attack person gets that little pesky debuff, but unless you're on Epic Hell difficulty, it's not really too big of a problem. It weakens them, but oh well, it's fine. Lilius actually works really well here, giving my team some extra tankiness with the Aureus and just, you know, free dual attacks, why not? So this first wave, it takes just a little bit, but it's going to go down pretty quickly overall. I have to change a couple of things when I use it for Epic Hell difficulty. I only use Sirmia of these 3 units in that team, but these 2 work really nicely just for, you know, a simple fight right here. So, ends pretty cleanly. And then we go to the second phase. In this phase, we just completely ignore basically all mechanics. There's not really much going on, but this is the same team I use in the Epic Hell difficulty one, and it just cleans it up. Like, really, it's nice, fast, and easy, right? Obviously, this overkills it by so much, you don't really need that much. Then the third phase, this is the same team that I actually use on Epic Hell difficulty. Of course, I have to manual it instead. But it actually works pretty nicely. Acades is really good for the cooldown reduction, and Hua Young is completely broken in this fight. She's kind of unbelievable how much damage she does. Never would have expected her to be so good in PvE and PvP, but she kind of just completely crushes this entire fight. Honestly, if I could, I would use her on all 3 phases. She's that good at this. So, she's in 0 danger whatsoever. Honestly, at this point, I almost think that she could just about solo this fight. I think it's entirely possible. But maybe she just needs that little extra boost to the greater attack at the beginning. And there we go. That's a nice, clean, auto hell difficulty run, I would say.